Have you ever heard of Dracula, Nosferatu, or Sekhmet? Have you ever asked yourself why there was such a craze for the undead? Where did these tales come from? And more importantly, are they real? Come along as we explore the history, literature, legend, biology, and the always evolving symbolism behind vampires and their folkloric counterparts. Each episode will dissect a different period of vampiric existence, ranging from the first ever recorded to the present day. Join us as we sink our teeth into tales old and new behind these blood-sucking creatures of the night.
In every generation, there is a chosen one. She alone will tell the tales of these blood-sucking creatures of the night. These are their stories. Welcome to Fangs and Fiction with Teddy Vecchio.
Hello and welcome to Fangs and Fiction. I'm your host Teddy Vecchio, and today we're going to be focusing on the Vampire Epidemic. This was a time period ranging from 1725 to 1755. Not necessarily the first tales of vampires, but they were the first to get the globe talking. But before we dive in, let's go outside and see what the public has to say. I am here at the Toronto Eaton Centre Indigo to ask the public about their views on vampires. Have you read any vampire fiction?
Not that I can think of, not explicitly.
I've read old Anne Rice. I've read modern stuff, Stephanie Meyer stuff too. So I've gone all over the vampire spectrum from blood to sparkles.
What famous vampires do you know?
Oh, I'm a big lover of Dracula.
I mean, there's Twilight and Vampire Diaries and all sorts of stuff like that, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
In older folklore, it was believed that vampires actually existed, but I was wondering, after hearing that, do you think that there is a possibility that they could have any semblance of biological legitimacy?
Part of me really thinks that it would be super cool if they did. This is why we read, right? This is why we get into fantasy, so that we can feel like it's a little closer to us.
I think it would be considered by society nowadays as a disease, but it could need to be not cured, but in control.
I don't think so in the way where I would say vampires truly existed. I think that most of the historical stuff was more based off of kind of a misunderstanding of the medicine at the time.
When you think of vampires, do you see in your mind more a seductive and romantic vampire, or do you see a horrific blood-sucking monster?
At the beginning it was a romantic, but afterwards I understood it's just a having a meal.
So specifically towards blood-sucking, do you think that is more of a sensual, seductive act, or is that more violent?
I would say that one's more sensual, because I think in most contexts that it's used, the vampire finds someone and then ends up sucking their blood, and it's all this heavily romanticized thing where it's oh my gosh, how could they? It's so evil, but it kind of like it.
I mean, it's very violent, but I guess depending on the person's interest, it could be very seductive as well. The throat is a very intimate area, so it is violent, but it's also a little seductive.
Being out at the Eaton Centre, it was great to hear everyone's thoughts, and after speaking with the public, slightly more people have knowledge on vampires than I expected. Now, let's talk epidemic. From 1725 to 1755, the vampire epidemic came into fruition. The interesting thing about this epidemic is that it was happening all across Europe, with similar accounts, and yet there was no cross-country communication of the events. This led the world to think, are vampires actually real? One of the cases that hit off the vampire epidemic was the tale of Peter Plogojowitz. In 1725, in the small village of Kisilava, Serbia, a farmer by the name of Peter Plogojowitz died. The real problem lies 3 days later, when he supposedly returned from the grave. It is said that he returned home to his son and asked for sustenance, but not the typical vampiric kind. He was just asking for some dinner. His son, in a shock, obeyed, but the next night when Plogojowitz returned, he refused. The next day, his son was found dead, and a few days later, so were 9 more people in the village. While you could chalk this up to coincidence, before their passing, the villagers complained of exhaustion, and many appeared to have lost considerable amounts of blood. And in the official report, it states that all of them had also proclaimed they had been visited by Plogojowitz during their sleep. This, of course, caused a bit of an outrage, and so much so that the parish priest wrote to the local magistrate, who continued passing this message until a military governor, a priest, and an executioner came together to exhume the bodies of those who had died, including Peter Plogojowitz. They, of course, were expecting to find a dead body and put the villagers' minds at ease, but unfortunately, that was not the case. His body had not decomposed. His hair and beard had grown. He reportedly had new skin and nails, and blood could be seen around his lips. To finish him off, they staked him through the heart, which unfortunately caused seemingly fresh blood to flow from his ears and mouth. After that failed attempt to ease the villagers, they proceeded to burn his body. This case was one of the first documented testimonies about vampires in Eastern Europe. People had hoped that this would be the first and last incident of these so-called vampires, when really, this was just the beginning. Now we have a special guest to talk on his experience with vampires and vampire fiction.
Alrighty, so joining us today is Gilbert Reid. He is a writer for radio, television, and a fiction writer. For 6 years, he taught English and English literature at the University of Messina in Sicily. Gilbert has also worked in PR in Italy for almost a decade, and as a journalist and a book reviewer, he has written for the Globe and Mail, Il Tempo, and many more. But today we are here to focus on your work in vampire fiction. Welcome, Gilbert.
Thank you, Teddy. Here I am.
So I think the first question we're going to ask is basically, who are you and what are you currently doing for a living?
Okay, well, you explained a little bit of the background. At one point, I started to write a series of vampire books. And I'm not being really fair to vampires because my vampire is a science fiction vampire. Vampires are pretty various, though, as you know better than anybody.
Yeah.
She is half alien and half human.
Perfect.
And she has to drink blood, but she's a good vampire. So she tries to find really evil people to eat or drink. The arc of the 8 volumes deals with her defending us from disaster. And our vampire has to stop this creature from destroying humanity.
It's interesting because I think in a lot of vampire fiction, it's typically the opposite way around. You know, it's typically the human kind of protecting humans against the vampires. But I like that it's kind of switched on yours. It's the vampire kind of prevailing to save humanity, which I think is really cool. So was there a point in your life when you started enjoying vampire fiction or kind of like getting into the nitty-gritty of like vampire folklore and vampire literature?
A little bit. Well, I knew a rather cadaverous girl when I was at high school, and she looked like a vampire. And some of us, I wasn't alone, were rather obsessed by her. And she was a bit of a punk before punk really came into fashion. She maintained a very mysterious air, and she never really explained any of her feelings or lack of feelings. And she would stare at you like she wanted to hypnotize you. When I read some Stephen King, where he has a few vampires here and there,
Yeah.
I thought, wow, there's my girl. And maybe this is a bit oblique, but I lived on a farm when I was a kid, I guess from when I was about 3 or 4 till I was 17 or 16 or 17. And we lived in a really spooky, very old farmhouse where all the boards creaked all the time. It was a very big place. It
Yeah.
had a lot of rooms. So you always thought a ghost was coming to get you, or a vampire, or a werewolf, or whatever it might be. And an English woman who stayed with us once, in one of the bedrooms, she said, a woman who was emerald green appeared to her in the middle of the night and stood beside her bed and didn't say anything, but was there. So that was sort of like an incubus, I think, which is, and you know this more than I do, I presume, that those spirits which inhabit you at night, they come to you in your dreams and they can take over your soul.
Yeah.
Or rob you of your soul. And they can become you. They are sort of body snatchers.
Yeah.
So there are a whole lot of things that were wrapped together in the idea of vampires. For me, it wasn't the classic trajectory. It was mostly King, and I did read a few other vampire books, and I watched a lot of vampire television.
Yeah, I love that you also brought up kind of aspects of the supernatural from your childhood. Because I am I wouldn't say I'm religious, but I definitely believe in ghosts. I am a very big believer in, you know, kind of supernatural elements of our reality, right? So nothing that's ever happened to me is necessarily like scary or spooky, but I can definitely feel like presences of other people. My mother passed away in January of this year, and something that always happened after her father had passed away is that she would find dimes everywhere, and they would be kind of scattered everywhere, and she would find them in very significant moments of her life. And after she's passed, I've started to notice the same thing, is that I find dimes everywhere. And it's such a bizarre thing to find because nobody carries change anymore. I mean, the Emerald Lady does sound a little bit horrifying to kind of have that like incubus kind of possess you, but I think ghosts can come in many different shapes and sizes. So, but I do think that the amount of people that I've met who've had supernatural interactions with things is a little spooky, to kind of lead to, you know, I see ghosts as being a very like kind and natural thing where it's just people who have passed on, who are like, their presence is still here. But the amount of people that I have met who have been like, yeah, I came down from my kitchen one morning and all of my cupboards and drawers were open. I'm like, that would freak me out.
The experience of finding coins everywhere, that's fascinating. I do think things like that happen. In this farmhouse, there was an attic over my bedroom with an entry in the roof of a closet.
Oh, lovely.
And there would be bangings and thumpings up there, particularly if I was alone in the house.
Always if you're alone.
And I had a dog who was a border collie and who shared something with you, name.
Lovely.
And who was extraordinarily intelligent. And he would be with me often if I happened to be alone at night in this big rambly house. And I'd be reading in a corner in some room, and all the rest of the house would be dark. And he'd look at me, and I think he was bored. And he'd stare down a dark corridor. And he'd begin to growl. And he would back up very slowly as if this monstrous thing was coming towards him. In this case, I would finally get up, hesitating, wondering what's down that corridor.
As one would.
Absolutely. And I would go and turn on the lights. And there was nothing there, of course. And he would look at me and grin. I got you.
Oh.
He used to play a lot of jokes. But I would be in my bedroom, and there was a long corridor outside the bedroom. And I would hear footsteps creaking along that corridor, actually moving along. And Teddy would stand up and go like something was coming. Mm-hmm. And he'd back towards the bed and look after me. So I think that there are such things as the spiritual presence, which from people who have passed away, who come and hang around us.
Do you think vampires could have actually existed?
Well, I think they could have. I'm a little bit doubtful myself, but yes, you're quite right. There was a great wave of vampire mania, if you like, in Eastern Europe, particularly Transylvania and what is Romania and Bulgaria now, and Hungary. So I think that, yes, it's possible. It's a little bit like witches. In fact, my vampire, who is called V, as in victory or vivacious or whatever, she has a debate with her Jesuit friend about the existence or not of vampires, as I said, but also about witches. And she says, well, I was almost burned as a witch in the 17th century in Germany. I think that there are more things in heaven and earth than our philosophy encompasses. To quote, I think it was Hamlet talking to Horatio, I think that was.
I think that's true, yeah. And especially with witches and stuff, like my father always believed that my nonna was a witch, right? Not necessarily practicing, but my nonna used to do this thing where when my father would come home and she could sense that something was off, she would put, I think, like a teaspoon of olive oil in a bowl, and if it stayed together, he was fine, and if it scattered, he was hexed. And they had to, fix him. And I think stuff like that, it kind of goes down not only in historic witchcraft, but also in a lot of like cultural ways. But I think it's very interesting that, we believe in witches sometimes. I mean, we had the whole Salem witch trials where people believed witches existed. And even now, I feel like some people can still totally see that being real. I know, especially on social media right now, I know a lot of people who are actively trying to practice witchcraft because they found out that their grandparents practiced it, or they found old journals of, what it was like when their ancestors were practicing, right? And I find it's interesting how we can believe in magic and yet not in more sinister creatures, right? So you can have witches, but when you say werewolves, vampires, ghosts, people typically bat an eye. They're typically like, oh, not quite.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's a step too far, you're saying, in a way.
Like, where's the line?
Where's the line? Yeah. Well, I had a Sicilian girlfriend when I was in Sicily those 6 years. And the relationship survived my leaving Sicily for a few years.
Lovely.
And we're still friends.
Great.
But mysteriously, if something's happening to her, I almost always know it.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I'm in North America and she's in Sicily.
Yeah.
And I'll give her a ring and she'll say, how did you know that X and X happened?
Absolutely.
So there are these weird connections. How they work, nobody knows, or at least I certainly don't. And I think in the books that I wrote with my heroine V, she's actually quite scientific about her own magical powers, and she has several of them. And she says, no, there's really a scientific approach here. But sometimes she has to doubt her own reduction of her powers to science.
Yeah. I think it's a tough concept. What are your favorite parts about writing vampire fiction?
Well, it's fun, particularly the fact that in my case, my vampire gobbles up bad people. She's sort of the heroine, though she's chopping people's heads off left and right, and is not very nice in some ways. But I think probably V is a force that tries to save us, and so I was able to cluster around that central figure all sorts of themes about the crisis of civilization.
Gilbert, thank you very much for your time. I had a lovely time chatting with you today.
Teddy, thank you. It's been wonderful. It's always great to talk to you.
Now, back onto the vampire epidemic. Similarly in Serbia, there was a man named Arnold Paole. Paole had supposedly been plagued by vampire attacks before moving to Medoegna. His attempts to get these vampires off of his soul consisted of finding the grave of the vampire pestering him, eating soil from the grave, and spreading the vampire's blood onto himself, likely by digging them up. Later on, in 1725, Paole fell from a hay wagon, breaking his neck, and died. One of the more unfortunate non-vampire-related deaths. Similarly to Plogojowitz, Paole didn't stay in the ground. 3 weeks after his death, 4 villagers complained about being visited by Paole and harassed by him. Following the complaints, all 4 villagers died. People remember his tales of being plagued by a vampire, and 40 days later, after much deliberation, the village decided to exhume his body. Now, like Plogojowitz, his body was showing no signs of death. Fresh blood was flowing through his body, his nails and hair were still growing, and his clothing and coffin were covered in blood. People saw not Paole, but a vampire. Following this, a stake was driven through his heart, which supposedly caused him to shriek and spew blood. The villagers then cut off his head and burned his body, and they proceeded to do the same to all 4 of his victims to prevent the same vampiric fate. While Plogojowitz and Paole weren't the first folkloric vampires, they did start the stir of the vampire epidemic. They were the first case of vampirism that made people really question their reality, and they made people think, are vampires actually real? Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Fangs in Fiction. Tune in next time as we discuss the social scare resulting from this epidemic and the thoughts of 18th century scientists, philosophers, and critics. Thanks again, and so long, suckers.